CSPT's 5th event of the school year, I would like to encourage all Furman students to consider coming to our next general membership meeting this Wednesday at 7 o'clock in Furman Hall 121. And now I'll introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo received his PhD in economics from Virginia Tech and is professor of economics at the Loyola University Maryland Selinger School of Business. Dr. DiLorenzo is the author or co-author of 10 books on subjects such as antitrust, group interest politics, historical revisionism, and interventionism. His books include Lincoln Unmasked, Hamilton's Curse, and How Capitalism Saved America. He is a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and an associated scholar of the Abbeville Institute. He lectures widely for these organizations and on college campuses. He is widely published in the economics literature and in popular publications and newspapers. He is a columnist for the website bluerockwell.com, has appeared on CNN, Fox News Channel, and MSNBC, and has been a guest on the Rush Limbaugh radio show. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom DiLorenzo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me again. This is my 4th trip to Furman, and I'm getting to know the town pretty well. I can even make it here from the airport without a map now.
Pretty good.
So the campus is kind of confusing, but once it's easy to get here, but once you get around all these circles, it's kind of confusing. But my topic, the students invited me to talk about the themes related to my book, How Capitalism Saved America, that was published several years ago. The subtitle is The Untold History of Our Country from the Pilgrims to the Present. And I wrote that book several years ago when my editor that I worked with at Random House suggested to me that after one of these scandals, some of you might remember reading about the Enron accounting scandal about, what was it, 10 years ago or so, that the same old story was going to be told, that this sort of cheating and dishonest behavior, criminal behavior, some of these people went to jail, a couple of them committed suicide actually, that this is just inherent about markets and capitalism, and that it would be useful to have a book that countered that kind of argument based on the type of writing I do, which is a combination of economics and economic history. So that's what I did. I wrote that book. And it turns out that several of the other books that I've written really are along the lines of the same theme. And so the theme I want to talk about tonight is how capitalism or markets is really misunderstood by most people because they conflate it or they confuse it with interventionism, which is sometimes called crony capitalism, sometimes called by economists, it's called mercantilism. It's a very old word, mercantilism. But crony capitalism or mercantilism is not the same at all as capitalism. So a lot of the problems that are created by government interventionism under the rubric of crony capitalism or mercantilism are blamed on markets, are blamed on the wrong thing, blamed by the government, by the people who create the problems, are blamed on the markets. So the government creates problems, and then it, of course, sort of one of the iron laws of government is government never, ever takes responsibility when things go wrong. It takes credit for everything, including things it has nothing to do with, such as, I think that, isn't it lately that the president is claiming credit for the new iPod that's out, the new iPhone that's out. He's claiming his policies led to the creation of the iPhone 5, or something like that. For those of you who have never taken a philosophy class, that's an example of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. After this, therefore because of this. Like the rooster crows in the morning, the sun came up, therefore the rooster crowing must have caused the sun to come up. So you know, the iPhone 5 was created, Barack Obama is president, therefore Barack Obama must be responsible for the iPhone 5. That's the sort of argument that Republicans and Democrats alike make all the time. But, you know, let me read some simple definitions of what capitalism is. Here's one from the economist Murray Rothbard. Free market capitalism is a network of free and voluntary exchanges in which producers work, produce, and exchange their products for the products of others through prices voluntarily arrived at. Period. That's it. It's not the Fed bailing out banks. You know, it's not the government giving billions of dollars to Chrysler and General Motors. That's not it. It's just what I just read. Ayn Rand, who has a new movie out, I thought she was dead, but there's a new movie out. I was shown too. Just came out. She said, capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. Those are the chief characteristics of capitalism. And Murray Rothbard contrasted that with interventionism or statism in general in another great quote I want to read you from my book here, where he says this: free market capitalism is a network of free and voluntary exchanges in which producers work, produce, and exchange their products for the products of others whose prices voluntarily arrived at. And then the second part of that is state capitalism consists of one or more groups making use of the coercive apparatus of the government for themselves by expropriating the production of others by force and violence. And so he contrasts real capitalism, which is what I proposed naming this book in the first place. My publisher at Random House chose How Capitalism Saved America. But he calls it state capitalism. It's another word for crony capitalism or mercantilism. And you know, this word mercantilism was really the topic of the famous book written by Adam Smith. Those of you, the students there who have ever taken Principles of Economics, have probably heard of this famous book, The Wealth of Nations. It's actually called an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. It was published in 1776 by the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith. It's considered by a lot of people to be really the first treatise on economics. And it was, the whole book is about this fat. It was a big critique of state capitalism, of crony capitalism. And in essence, what this is state capitalism is a system of policies that primarily benefits the producers, the business people, at the expense of consumers and everybody else. And it's not unusual that this type of system is pervasive in a lot of countries, because after all, businesses are often a very well-organized, politically well-organized group. They know what they want, higher prices and higher profits. Whereas we consumers, we're not organized, we're disorganized, there are millions of us, and we're largely paying attention to going to school, doing our job, raising families. We don't really pay attention to public policy and the things that the government is doing that may have a very negative effect on our pocketbooks. But the businesses do, and their unions sometimes. If they're unionized industries, they work hand in hand. They know about these government policies because they benefit from them. And so economists like myself have known for a long time, it's an important distinction between these two things, mercantilism and capitalism. And some of you are familiar with some of the other books that I've written that actually talk about these themes. My books, The Real Lincoln, and Lincoln Unmasked, and my other book is entitled Hamilton's Curse. And the subtitle of Hamilton's Curse is How Jefferson's Archenemy Betrayed the American Revolution and What It Means for Americans Today. And really what I do in those three books is I talk about the whole history from the time of the American founding up to the present day. Hamilton's Curse talks up to almost the present day of this long battle, more than 200-year-old battle between, on the one hand, advocates of letting markets work, letting us trade peacefully and voluntarily with each other, let us be entrepreneurs, let us be producers and consumers, leave us alone. And those people who have always wanted government to somehow control the economy. Hamilton started out on the side of the interventionists. He wanted to bring the British mercantilist system that Adam Smith ranted and raved against to America. He just wanted an Americanized version of that. And then he died in a famous duel, of course, with Aaron Burr. And my old friend Gary North actually once started up an Aaron Burr Society. And they had ball caps, and their logo was "Not Soon Enough." Aaron Burr shot Hamilton and killed him, of course. And these were mostly academics who understood that Hamilton was a big interventionist, and the Americans had just fought a revolution against this system. And the Jeffersonians, who were Hamilton's nemesis, Jefferson himself, their opinion was, why on earth would we want this system here in America? We just fought a long and bloody revolution to get away from that system. And but the Hamiltonians, or the state capitalists, if you will, their position was always, it's not a bad system if you're the one on the money collecting end. If you're on the money paying end, yeah, it's a bad system. That's why the colonists rebelled. But if you're on the money collecting side, it's a good gig. And so they were very crass and Machiavellian about it. And so Hamilton passed, and then the mantle of that system was picked up by the Whigs, the American Whig Party, by the time you get to the 1830s, and I've written about this in my books on Lincoln and on Hamilton, and then later the Republican Party. And the Jefferson and his political disciples and descendants were always the opponents, for the most part, of interventionism, crony capitalism, state capitalism, whatever you want to call it. And then, of course, the Hamiltonians achieved their great victory at the end of the war to prevent Southern independence, as I call it. And when the Hamiltonianism finally ran amok with corporate welfare for the railroad corporations and the high protectionist tariffs in the 50% range for 60 years after the Civil War, as some people call it. And so these three books of mine really tell the whole story of the battle between the two factions in American history over economics, over do we want to have market economy, or do we want to have interventionism, statism, crony capitalism? The system we live under today, my old friend Robert Higgs calls it participatory fascism. It's essentially fascism, but they let us vote. They let us vote. In fact, on my office door at Loyola University, I have a little cartoon that someone just made up recently. And it says voting, and underneath it says the slave's suggestion box. And there's two little boxes where you can check. One says obey, and the other one says obey. And underneath it says, picking a new master every couple of years doesn't make you free, which is true, which is pretty much true. And so Bob Higgs also told me, in his opinion, the only reason that we're allowed to have free speech is our rulers know it doesn't really matter. So we can say whatever we want. And so there we have, that's where we are today. But I thought I'd give some examples to illustrate this point about the difference between capitalism and state capitalism, or crony capitalism, mercantilism. And because there are a lot of myths in American economic history about this, and myths are very powerful. Policymakers are always resorting back to history, or at least certain types of interpretations of history. It's not always real history, it's always certain interpretations of history. And one myth is about the so-called robber barons of the 19th century, of the late 19th century. And there's a lot of confusion about this. And there's a great little book that if anybody, any of the students or anyone is interested in this topic, there's a great book on this by Burton Folsom. It's spelled F-O-L-S-O-M. It was originally called, I think it's called The Myth of the Robber Barons. The second edition had a different title, but The Myth of the Robber Barons. And so, and what he does is he distinguishes between real capitalists, entrepreneurs, business creators, product creators, Steve Jobs, people of that sort, and what he calls political entrepreneurs. So you got real entrepreneurs, people who create products, start businesses, hire people, grow their businesses, take risks, and thrive if they're successful. And then you've got political entrepreneurs who make their money by using their political connections to artificially prop up the price of their product, to force people to buy their product, to destroy competition, to keep competitors out of the market. And so, for example, a political entrepreneur would have been Leland Stanford, who founded Stanford University. He was a governor of California and a United States senator, and he used his political connections, winning around politics, to have laws passed that prohibited competition for his railroad line. He was involved in a railroad line in California, so it was illegal to compete with his railroad within the state of California. And even I could make money in a business like that if competition was not. Even a professor could make money in a situation like that. So that was a political entrepreneur. And then you could contrast that to real entrepreneurs who made money basically by pleasing consumers. In Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations, one of my favorite little sentences is Adam Smith explaining what markets were all about. Because keep in mind, this was the world that had emerged from feudalism, and this whole world of commerce was relatively new. And philosophers were writing books like Adam Smith's on the topic of, well, is this good or bad for society, this pursuit of money by everybody in business? What is a good thing or a bad thing for the society as a whole? And the one sentence there that Adam Smith used to describe markets is give me that which I want and I will give you that which you want. That's pretty much what markets are all about. And so even in the robber baron era in the late 19th century, you had the political entrepreneurs like Leland Stanford, who made a lot of money simply through political connections that thwarted competition. But you also had genuine entrepreneurs. One of the persons I write about in my book, How Capitalism Saved America, is a man named James J. Hill, who was a Canadian who came to Minnesota, and his father died when he was 10. He had one eye. He helped his mother raise his siblings as a 10, 11, 12-year-old. And he was a very hard worker and a very ingenious and a highly intelligent person, obviously, because he saved every penny, and he ended up founding a railroad, a transcontinental railroad called the Great Northern. And he became one of the great entrepreneurs in American history. And it is said that he's one of the characters in Atlas Shrugged is based on, he's supposed to be James J. Hill. And I'm going to just read you one example of what kind of person James J. Hill was, he built a transcontinental railroad without any government subsidies at a time when all of his competitors were government subsidized transcontinental railroads. So not only did he build a transcontinental railroad without even land grants, he paid Indians for rights-of-way across their land out in the western United States with livestock, money, whatever they could be traded for. Whereas the government-subsidized railroads just called in the army and had them kill all the Indians. So they socialized the cost of building the railroads in that way. But James J. Hill did not do that. And so not only did he build a transcontinental railroad with private capital, investors from all over the world invested in his business, but he did it in a time when his competition was receiving millions of dollars in land grants and other types of subsidies by the U.S. government. And here's, in Burton Folsom's book, there's a description of James J. Hill's railroad, which is called the Great Northern. He says this: Hill's quest for short routes, low grades, and few curvatures was an obsession. In 1889, Hill conquered the Rocky Mountains by finding the legendary Marias Pass. Lewis and Clark had described a low pass through the Rockies back in 1805, but later no one seemed to know whether it really existed, or if it did, where it was. Hill wanted the best gradient so much that he hired a man to spend months searching western Montana for this legendary pass. He did in fact find it, and the ecstatic Hill shortened his route by almost 100 miles. He did things such as giving livestock and seeds to the farmers along the way, because he understood that if they did not prosper, his railroad would not prosper. If the towns along the way did not prosper, who would be going on his railroad? So he spent a lot of money investing in these communities in every way he could to make sure that they prospered, not because he was a Mother Teresa, but he was a smart businessman, and he understood that if they prosper, I prosper, and what's wrong with that? Now contrast that to how the government-subsidized railroads run by the political entrepreneurs, the people with political connections to the Republican Party. The chief engineer was an old friend of Abe Lincoln's named Grenville Dodge. And even during the Civil War, so-called, Grenville Dodge was made a general, even though he wasn't a military guy. But basically his job was to kill Indians who would be in the way of where the railroads would be built after the war, when they would start building the railroads. And on that, by the way, in June of 1861, Lincoln called a special session of Congress, June of 1861, okay, a special session of Congress to do what? To start building a railroad to California. You know, the war was just started. You know, the first big major battle in Manassas was about to begin. And what does Congress need to be called back for? To spend millions of dollars building a railroad line from Iowa to California. And that tells you how important the Republican Party at the time thought subsidizing the railroad companies was in terms of a priority to them. And they did. And Grenville Dodge, after the war, was the chief engineer. And when he built the railroad, he recommended to the U.S. government that they make slaves out of the Indians and force the Indians to dig the railroad beds. But the government said, no, we're not going to do that, and they tried to kill all the Indians instead. And I've actually published an academic journal article on this in the Independent Review a couple of years ago. You can look up, the independent.org is the website, and if you look at it, it's on violence in the American West, myth versus reality is the title, where I argue that the real violence was not the shootouts at the OK Corral. It was the civil society was relatively peaceful. The real violence was what the U.S. government, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Hancock, all the rest, what they did to the Plains Indians after the war. It was literally a war of genocide. And I quote Sherman himself as saying that the purpose of this was to make way for the railroads. So it's in his memoirs. You see right there in black and white. And so that's what happened with the political entrepreneurs. They used the government and the military as an indirect subsidy to their railroads. Like I said, James J. Hill paid the Indians for right-of-way across their land. The government subsidized railroads, killed the Indians, and a lot of non-Indians for that matter. And here's how Folsom describes how Grenville Dodge went about as a political entrepreneur building the railroad. And keep in mind, the government paid these people a per mile subsidy. He said, since Dodge was in a hurry, he laid track on the ice and snow. Naturally, the line had to be rebuilt in the spring. What was worse, unanticipated spring flooding along the lower fork of the Platte River washed out rails, bridges, and telephone poles, doing at least $50,000 damage in the first year. No wonder some observers estimated the actual building cost at almost 3 times what it should have been. So build a railroad line on top of 10 feet of ice pack and get paid for it by the government. And then when the ice melts, you get paid a second time. Even I could make money in a business like that. And that's how they built it. And I guess I could write on this block, this whatever you call this now. So in other words, here's James J. Hill. Here's our map of America. Okay. Here's Furman right here. Here's Iowa. It's a little north for Iowa. Here's Minnesota. Here's James J. Hill's line to the Pacific. And here's the Northern Pacific and the Central Pacific built by the government. Built like that for the obvious reason that in order to get votes in Congress for the subsidy, you had to promise to build a line to the town where the congressman was from. And so you had to build these crazy circuitous routes because what determines the money in a situation where there's political entrepreneurship is politics, not economics. If what it's about is providing the best service to the customers, because that's how you make the most money, you pick this route. You have James J. Hill build the railroad. If, on the other hand, if it's politicized industry, you build a route kind of like this. And that's exactly what happened. And here's another passage from Burton Folsom's book about how the political entrepreneurs spent their time. James J. Hill is out there. He sometimes was literally working alongside some of the people, the crew, the work crews, digging the railroad beds. He bought the highest quality wood he could find for the ties, the highest quality steel. He took competitive bids from all over the world for the steel rails. That's what he occupied his time with. No stone left unturned to cut costs and improve the quality of the service, to make the communities thrive along the way. Here's how the political entrepreneurs spent their time. One of the big shots was named Thomas Durant. And And here's what Folsom says about him. In 1866, Thomas Durant wined and dined 150 prominent citizens, including senators and ambassador and government bureaucrats, along a completed section of the railroad. He hired an orchestra, a caterer, 6 cooks, a magician to pull subsidies out of a hat, question mark, and a photographer. For those with ecumenical palates, he served Chinese duck and Roman goose. The more adventurous were offered roast ox and antelope. All could have expensive wine, and for dessert, strawberries, peaches, and cherries. After dinner, some of the men hunted buffalo from their coaches. Durant hoped that all would go back to Washington, inclined to repay the Union Pacific Railroad for its hospitality. And so that's how the political entrepreneurs spent their time, using tax dollars to wine and dine politicians to get more tax dollars. And so the emphasis is always on politics, not economics with these sorts of businesses. I also talk about in my books about how blatant it was, how blatant the bribery was, where Thaddeus Stevens, the congressman from Pennsylvania, told them, I'll vote for the subsidies, but you have to use American-made steel. Guess what business Thaddeus Stevens was in up in Pennsylvania? Anybody know? Steel manufacturer. There was a man named Oakes Ames from Massachusetts who said, well, yeah, you can have my vote in Congress, but you have to use American-made shovels. Guess what business Oakes Ames was in? It was manufacturing. What do you think he was manufacturing? They must have taken a lot of shovels to dig railroad beds from Iowa to California, as far as that's concerned. And so that's the sort of thing that went on, and it created literally a dynasty of American families who became extraordinarily wealthy during this time. And like the Cornells, for example, one name you might be familiar with as far as that is concerned. And so there are a lot of families that to this day are extraordinarily wealthy because this wealth has been handed down, but it was created through politics. It wasn't created by producing things of value better than anybody else could do. And so that's one example of what I mean. But then, you know, when one of the greatest corruption scandals in American history up to that point was the Crédit Mobilier scandal. That's how it's spelled. It was the political entrepreneurs who were receiving government subsidies for the railroads who had various schemes going on where they would set up their own companies to supposedly sell railroad ties, you know, products to their other company that they ran. If they ran the Union Pacific, they would set up a company with a name like that, and they would pay themselves grossly inflated prices. And so they would, you know, buy the thing for $1 and sell it to themselves with tax money for $100. And this was quite the scheme. And they would buy the votes of members of Congress and the support of the administration officials by giving them stock in this company and insider information. They would let them know that you know, we're about to do this. We're about to pay ourselves 100 times what we paid for this these railroad ties. Here's 1,000 shares of stock that are worth maybe $1 a share today if we have your vote. And so Congressman X gets 1,000 shares of stock, and then a month later, his $1,000 investment is worth $50,000 because of the insider trading information, the political insider trading that went on. This all blew up, though, because of a spat between some of the crooks, some of the political crooks. One of them got so angry that he called the media out and explained to the media what was going on. And so if you were to look up this Crédit Mobilier scandal on the web, you could read all about this. But this was inevitable. It was inherent. It was why the old Jeffersonians always objected to use of tax dollars for corporations to do anything, because it inevitably would lead to corruption and this sort of political squalor, which it truly did. But guess who gets blamed eventually for this? Capitalism. So I mean, this sort of thing was blamed, and eventually blamed on markets, and capitalism run amok and led to the so-called progressive movement of the late 19th, early 20th century that imposed all sorts of government regulation to supposedly tame capitalism. But guess what? The capitalists tamed the regulations. Well, not capitalists, the crony capitalists tamed the regulators. The regulators didn't tame the crony capitalists. There's an excellent book on this by Gabriel Kolko, K-O-L-K-O. It's called The Triumph of Conservatism. It's about how in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was really big corporations in America who wanted government regulation. They wanted the Food and Drug Act. They wanted the Federal Trade Commission and things like this because they thought correctly that they could control it, that they could use it to keep out competition and to impose heavy regulatory costs on their smaller competitors, which they did. So I would recommend Gabriel Kolko's book. There's another one by Butler Schaefer entitled In Restraint of Trade that pretty much tells the same story. And so, but what has gone down in history is that real capitalism has been blamed for these problems that were created by crony capitalism. And another example of a real capitalist was John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller became arguably the wealthiest man in the world during his era. Sort of the same story as James J. Hill. James J. Hill, sorry. He grew up basically penniless, like Hill did. And he was a very hard worker, notoriously stingy, saved every penny. And by the time he was in his late 20s or so, he had saved up enough money to buy a small oil refinery in Cleveland. I think he bought it for $24,000, according to one of the history books that I read. You'd probably pay a little more for a refinery today, but it wasn't much of a refinery. I mean, primitive, a very primitive technology, and turned it into Standard Oil. He and his brother, who turned out to be a business genius. But basically how Rockefeller made his money is by figuring out how to make refined petroleum cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, year in and year out, year in and year out. Refined oil went from 30 cents a gallon in 1869. He started his company in 1866 to 8 cents a gallon in 1885, for example. And so that's basically how Rockefeller made his money. It's how Henry Ford made his money. It's how James J. Hill made his money, by figuring out how to produce these services or these goods cheaper and cheaper for the masses. The way capitalism has always worked is that an invention like this is first only for the affluent or the wealthy. Refrigerators were like that. Cars were like that. But the capitalists don't get really, really wealthy unless they figure out how to make this thing cheaply enough so that just about anybody can afford one. And once you do that, and you can sell 30 or 40 million of them, then you're talking real wealth. It's not just selling it to the Donald Trumps of the world that creates these enormously wealthy people in history. It's selling to ordinary working people at a very low price. And there's of course, Rockefeller had a lot of enemies. That's one of the mottos of American history is that no good capitalist deed ever goes unpunished by the people who are envious or the people who are just imperialistic and want the government to control everything. But envy is probably the main reason why you see this. If Walmart sells cheap groceries, well, they're enemy number one, of course. They have to be enemy number one. They sell cheap groceries compared to the unionized grocery stores. Like, what an outrage that they sell groceries 30% cheaper than the unionized stores. They must be stopped. That's the type of thing that goes on in America. It always has. And one of Rockefeller's big enemies in the journalistic world was a woman named Ida Tarbell, whose brother was the treasurer of one of Rockefeller's competitors, the Pure Oil Company, which went out of business because their prices were too high. And so Ida Tarbell had an axe to grind, and she was so obsessed about this. I guess it must have cost her a lot of money. I guess her brother must have been sharing his loot with her somehow, I guess. So, because she was so incensed about this that she wrote a whole book on the history of the Standard Oil Company. And but if you read this book, it's like she writes about Standard Oil, Rockefeller's company, as a marvel of efficiency. He says, I'll read you to one passage. Not far away from the canning works on Newton Creek is an oil refinery. This oil runs into the canning works And as the new-made cans come down by a chute from the works above, where they have just been finished, they are filled 12 at a time with oil made a few miles away. The filling apparatus is admirable. As the new-made cans come down the chute, they are distributed 12 in a row along one side of a turntable. So she's just marveling over this mass production, which at the time was a new thing in the world. And she goes on and on and on, and she concludes that, quote, "It is a marvelous example of economy, not only in materials, but in time and footsteps." So Rockefeller and his brother were even counting the footsteps of the workers, and the fact of minimizing, no stone left unturned, to make this stuff cheaper and cheaper and cheaper year in and year out, and which they did, and they succeeded tremendously. So even Rockefeller's enemies, political enemies, admitted that the way he made his money was to produce things cheaper and cheaper because it was marvelously efficient. And this type of, and if you study economic history like I do, this type of thinking that he made things cheaper and cheaper, therefore he must be condemned or possibly thrown in prison. If you fast forward to the 1950s, the Alcoa company was sued by the government for violating the antitrust laws, and the judge in the case had the perfect name for a judge. If I was ever a judge, I would change my name to this. It was Learned Hand. Learned, sounds like he must be a really smart guy. Learned Hand. So let's see if I can find this quote from Learned Hand here. And Learned found the Alcoa company guilty of violating the anti-monopoly laws, antitrust laws. And here's what he said. In his statement, he condemned Alcoa for its, quote, its superior skill, foresight, and industry, which was exclusionary. That is, it excluded other businesses that did not have superior skill, foresight, and industry. What an outrage. He condemned Coa for advertising